The fog rolled thick over Boston Harbor that autumn morning in 1706, swallowing the mass of merchant ships like the sea swallows secrets. James Sullivan stood at his father's bedside watching the old man's chest rise and fall with the labored rhythm of a ship taking on water. Captain William Sullivan had sailed through 2 wars and countless storms, but this battle, the one against time and mortality, he was losing. The room smelled of camphor and old wood of lives lived hard and promises kept. On the wall hung William's commission from the Continental Navy, faded now, but still legible, a testament to when honor meant something, you could touch something worth bleeding for. James, the old man whispered, his voice like wind through torn sails. Come closer, boy. James leaned in, 26 years old, but feeling like a child again. His father's hand, once strong enough to haul rigging in a gale, trembled as it gripped his son's wrist. A man's word is his bond, William said, each word costing him breath he couldn't spare. I taught you that, but I need to hear you say it. I need to know you understand. I understand, Father. No. The grip tightened with surprising strength. Say the words. Swear it to me. James felt something catch in his throat. Through the window he could see the harbor, where his own ship, the honest merchant, sat at anchor. Beyond that, the home he shared with Margaret and 4-year-old Samuel. A good life, an honest life, the kind of life his father had always demanded to him. I swear, James said, his voice steady, I'll never take what isn't earned. I'll never shed innocent blood. I'll keep my word even when it costs me everything. William Sullivan smiled, then a ghost of the grin that had charmed James's mother decades ago. Even when it cost you everything, he repeated. Remember you said that, son, because someday it will. 3 hours later, William Sullivan was gone. James sat with the body until dawn, watching the fog lift and the harbor come alive with the sounds of commerce and honest labor. He didn't know then that he'd just made a promise that would destroy his life and save his soul. He didn't know that 21 years later, he'd still be trying to keep it. But that morning, as he walked home to tell Margaret that Samuel would grow up without a grandfather, James Sullivan believed in the kind of honor that doesn't bend, the kind of principles that stand firm against any storm. He believed with the certainty of youth that a man could be good and the world would reward him for it. The world had other lessons to teach. 6 months later, James stood on the deck of the honest merchant, watching the coast of Cuba emerge from the morning haze like a promise of profit. The hold was full of New England timber, whale oil, and salted cod. In Havana, he'd trade it for sugar rum and Spanish silver. A good voyage, a profitable voyage. The kind that would let him buy Margaret the house she'd been dreaming of, the one with the garden overlooking the harbor. Captain, his first mate called, ship on the horizon, coming fast. James raised his spyglass. At first he saw nothing but empty ocean. Then the ship emerged, sails full, cutting through the water like a knife through silk. Too fast for a merchant vessel. Too purposeful for anything honest. All hands, James ordered, his voice carrying across the deck. Prepare to come about. We're running. But the honest merchant was built for cargo, not speed. The pursuing ship gained with every passing minute. James could see her clearly now, a sleek sloop with gun ports open like hungry mouths. No flag flew from her mast, which was answer enough. Pirates. The first cannonball screamed overhead, a warning shot that sent splinters flying from the mainmast. James's crew, honest sailors, all froze at their stations. These were men who knew how to tie knots and read stars, not how to fight for their lives. Strike your colors, a voice called across the water, accented with the liquid vowels of Spain. Or the next shot goes through your hull. James looked at his crew. Young Tom Peterson, barely 16, who sent half his wages home to his widowed mother. Old Henry Chase, who'd sailed with James's father and knew no other life. 23 men who trusted him to bring them home safe. He lowered the flag. The pirates swarmed aboard with practiced efficiency, their cutlasses gleaming in the Caribbean sun. They weren't the wild-eyed monsters James had imagined. They moved with military precision, securing the crew, searching the cargo hold, every action purposeful and controlled. Their captain was the last across. He was perhaps 40 tall and lean, with the bearing of someone who'd commanded men in a different life. His coat was fine Spanish silk, now salt-stained and worn. His eyes were the color of steel in winter. I am Don Rafael de Silva, he said, his English perfect despite the accent. And you, Captain, have a choice to make. James said nothing. His hand itched for the pistol they'd already taken from him. Your cargo is valuable, but not exceptional. Raphael continued walking slowly around the deck, as if inspecting troops. Your ship is solid but unremarkable. Your crew is frightened and useless in a fight. None of this interests me. He stopped in front of James close enough that James could smell tobacco and rum on his breath. What interests me, Raphael said quietly, is that you surrendered without firing a shot. You chose their lives over your pride. That shows wisdom. Or perhaps just cowardice. I haven't decided which. I'm no coward, James said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. No. Raphael smiled. Then prove it. Join my crew. I need men who can navigate these waters, who understand the merchant routes. Men with something to lose which makes them careful. Men with nothing to gain but survival. I'll never join you. I'd rather hang. Brave words. Raphael's smile didn't waver. But I'm not offering you a choice. I'm offering them one. He gestured to James's crew huddled together near the mainmast. Here's the arrangement, Captain Sullivan. Yes, I know your name. I know you have a wife in Boston, a young son, a modest house near the harbor. I make it my business to know things. Your crew, all 23 of them, are now my property. In 6 months, if you return to this spot with $10,000, I'll release them. If not, I'll sell them to the Spanish mines. Most won't survive a year. The deck seemed to tilt beneath James's feet, though the sea was calm. I don't have that kind of money. Then earn it. Raphael turned to leave, then paused. Or join us and earn it faster. The offer stands. Either way, the clock is ticking, Captain. 6 months. And because I'm not without mercy, I'll give you this. He reached into his coat and pulled out a compass, old and brass with initials carved into the case. J.S. James's own compass, the one his father had given him on his 16th birthday. To find your way back, Raphael said. If you're man enough to try. They left James alone on his ship, stripped of cargo and crew with nothing but a skeletal crew of 4 men, too old or too young to be worth taking. As the pirate ship disappeared over the horizon, James stood at the wheel and calculated the impossible mathematics of his situation. $10,000, more money than he'd make in 5 years of honest trade, 6 months to acquire it, and a crew of 23 men whose lives depended on him succeeding. He pointed the honest merchant toward Boston and began to plan. Margaret was hanging laundry when he returned 3 weeks later. The sight of her, so ordinary and perfect, nearly broke him. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face lighting up with joy that would soon turn to horror. James, you're home early. Is everything? She saw his face and stopped. What happened? He told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her hands slowly twisting the wet sheet she'd been hanging. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. $10,000, she finally said. I've been to every merchant, every investor. No one will loan that kind of money against future earnings. The ship itself isn't worth half that. I've tried Margaret. God knows I've tried. She looked toward the house where Samuel was napping. And if you don't get it, those men, I know. Some of them have families. Tom Peterson's mother depends on his wages. I know. Margaret's jaw set in the way it did when she'd made a decision. Then we'll find a way. Sell the house. Sell everything. I'll take work. It won't be enough. James caught her hands. Even if we sold everything we own, it wouldn't be half what we need. Then what will you do? James didn't answer. He couldn't because the only answer that made sense was the one he couldn't speak aloud. Not yet. Not to her. That night he lay awake listening to Margaret breathe beside him and Samuel's small snores from the next room. Through the window he could see the harbor and the merchant ships at anchor, their holds full of goods that didn't belong to him. Goods worth thousands, tens of thousands. His father's voice echoed in his memory. I'll never take what isn't earned. I'll never shed innocent blood. But what about the blood of 23 men who trusted him? What about Tom Peterson's mother, who'd starve without her son's wages? What about his own oath spoken over his father's dying body to keep his word, even when it cost him everything? The mathematics were brutal and simple. To keep his word to his father, he'd have to break it. To save his crew, he'd have to become the thing he'd sworn never to be. He rose before dawn and walked to the headquarters of the Boston Merchants Guild. The building was dark, the streets empty. In his pocket was a pry bar he'd taken from his own tool chest. His hands shook as he forced the lock on the back door. The guild's strongbox held the collective funds of 50 merchants' money waiting to be distributed for various ventures and investments. James knew this because he'd contributed to it himself, small amounts saved over years of honest work. He'd sat in meetings where they'd discussed the exact amount, had volunteered to help count it last month. $3,247. Not enough to save his crew, but enough to make the theft unforgivable. He forced the strongbox open with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The money was heavy, heavier than gold, should be weighted with the lives it would ruin. The merchants who'd lose their investments, their families. The chain of destruction spreading out from this single moment like ripples in still water. James packed it into a canvas bag and left the way he'd come. By the time the sun rose, he was on the road south, leaving behind everything he'd ever been. The guild discovered the theft within hours. By noon, notices were posted offering a reward for James Sullivan's capture. By evening, Margaret knew. She stood in their home reading the notice someone had shoved under the door, while Samuel played with wooden blocks at her feet, oblivious to the fact that his father had just made him the son of a wanted criminal. She didn't cry. She was a ship captain's daughter raised to weather storms. She simply folded the notice, placed it in a drawer, and began the process of learning to live with the choice her husband had made. Learning to explain to a 4-year-old boy why his father wasn't coming home. Meanwhile, James rode south with $3,000 that felt like 30 pieces of silver, heading toward the Caribbean and a man who'd offered him a devil's bargain. He'd broken his oath to his father. He'd destroyed his name. He'd stolen from honest men and abandoned his family. And he'd do it all again if it meant saving 23 lives. That was the terrible truth he learned on that journey. Honor wasn't the clean, simple thing his father had taught him. It was messy and bloody, and sometimes required you to become what you hated most. Real honor didn't stand firm against every storm. Sometimes it bent, sometimes it broke, and sometimes, just sometimes, that breaking was the only way to keep from shattering completely. He reached the rendezvous point in Cuba 3 months later, the stolen money and 5 months of desperate trading condensed into a sum that was still $3,000 short. He stood on the beach where Raphael had told him to wait, watching the horizon for a ship that might not come. When it did, emerging from the sun still like a ghost, James felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, never peace again, but a kind of grim certainty. Raphael's boat touched the beach. The Spanish captain stepped out, his boots splashing in the surf, and regarded James with those steel winter eyes. "You came," Raphael said. "I confess I didn't think you would. Most men would have run, started over somewhere new. I gave my word." "Yes, about that." Raphael gestured to the bag at James's feet. "You have the money. 7,000, it's all I could get. But if you give me another month—" "Stop." Raphael held up his hand. "You misunderstand our arrangement. I don't want your money, Captain Sullivan. I never did." James stared at him. "I wanted to know what kind of man you were," Raphael continued. "Whether you'd run or fight. Whether you'd sacrifice everything for men who are, let's be honest, not worth saving. Tom Peterson gambles away half his wages. Henry Chase is drunk more often than sober. Your crew aren't heroes. They're ordinary, flawed men. They're my responsibility." "Exactly." Raphael's smile was sad. "And that's why I'm offering you the choice again. Keep your money, join my crew, work off the debt with service instead of silver, or walk away and I'll release your men anyway. They've been sitting in a camp for 3 months doing nothing but cost me money. I'd be happy to be rid of them." James felt the world tilt again. "You just let them go." "I'm not a monster, Captain. I'm a businessman. Sometimes the business is violence, yes. But I don't deal in slavery. I don't break men for sport. Your crew will go free either way. The only question is what you do next." "I don't understand. Why the test? Why any of this?" Raphael stepped closer, and for the first time, James saw something raw in those winter eyes. "Because 3 years ago, I was a captain in the Spanish Navy. I had honor. I had a code. I had a family waiting in Seville. And then my government ordered me to fire on a ship full of refugees, men and women and children fleeing persecution. I refused. They called it mutiny. They hanged my first officer. They would have hanged me too, but I escaped." He paused, looking out at the dark water. I became what they accused me of being, a pirate, an outlaw. I told myself it was necessity, that I had no choice. But every day I make choices, Captain Sullivan. Every raid, every prize, every act of violence. I chose this, and I needed to know if you were a man who understood that. Who understood that sometimes honor requires you to break every rule except the ones that matter. And if I choose to walk away, take my crew and go home, then you prove me wrong about you, and we both move on. James looked at the bag of money, 3,000 of it stolen, 4,000 earned through trades that bent every principle his father had taught him, all of it dirty in one way or another, all of it insufficient to buy back what he'd lost. If I join you, James said slowly, it's not forever. I work off the debt and then I go home. Of course, Agrees. And we don't attack ships carrying families. No women, no children. Raphael's smile returned. I can live with that. And no slavery. Any ship we take, any prisoners we hold, they get set free or ransomed fairly. No mines, no plantations. You drive a hard bargain for a man with no leverage. Those are my terms. Raphael extended his hand. Then welcome aboard, Captain Sullivan. Though I should warn you, the moment you shake my hand, you become a wanted man in every civilized port from here to England. There's no going back from this. James thought of Margaret reading that notice, of Samuel learning to call another man father, of the life he'd already lost the moment he'd pried open that strongbox. Raphael was wrong. There was no going back because there was nothing to go back to. He shook the Spanish pirate's hand. One more thing, Raphael said. From now on, you don't use your real name. Out here, Captain James Sullivan is dead. You need to be someone else. Who? Raphael smiled. That's up to you. Choose wisely. Names have power. They can protect you or condemn you. They can remind you of who you were or help you forget. That night on the deck of Raphael's ship, the Raven's Fury, James stood at the rail and watched the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere to the north, Margaret was putting Samuel to bed. Somewhere in this vast ocean, his crew was waiting to be released. Somewhere in the past, there was a man who'd sworn an oath over his father's deathbed and meant it with every fiber of his being. But that man was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone who'd learned that honor wasn't about never breaking your word. It was about choosing which promises to keep when you couldn't keep them all. James Sullivan was dead. The man who would become Captain Sullivan, pirate and outlaw hunter of British ships and enemy of civilization, was just being born. And the price of that birth would be paid in blood and years and every illusion he'd ever held about the way the world worked. The Caribbean sun beat down on the deck of the Raven's Fury with the weight of divine judgment. James, who no longer thought of himself by that name, stood at the helm, learning the geometry of predation. Don Raphael had been teaching him for 3 weeks how to read a ship by its sail pattern, how to judge the value of a prize by the height it rode in the water, how to calculate the mathematics of pursuit, the angle of approach that would cut off escape while preserving the cargo you were stealing. There, Raphael said, pointing to a speck on the horizon. What do you see? James raised the spyglass. A merchant ship, Dutch by the flag, riding low, which meant a full hold. 2 masts, limited armament. The kind of vessel his own honest merchant had been a lifetime ago. Good prize, James said, the words tasting like ash. And she's got families aboard. You can tell by the laundry hanging on the stern rail. Women's dresses, children's clothes. Raphael nodded approval. So we let her pass. Good. Raphael clapped him on the shoulder. You're learning. Most men who come to this life, they forget why they started. They let the violence consume them. But you, Captain, you remember, that will either save you or destroy you. I haven't decided which. James lowered the spyglass. In 3 weeks, he'd participated in 4 raids. They'd taken 3 ships, let 1 go. The profits had been substantial. The cost to his soul had been higher. He'd killed his first man on the 2nd raid. A British merchantman that refused to strike colors, that fought back with the desperation of men who knew pirates showed no mercy. In the chaos of boarding, a sailor came at James with a cutlass. Instinct training from childhood with his father, muscle memory took over. James's blade found the man's throat before his conscious mind registered the threat. The sailor had been perhaps 18. He died with his eyes wide and surprised, as if shocked that the world could end so quickly, so randomly, so far from home. James could still see those eyes when he closed his own. "You're thinking about the boy," Raphael said, reading him with the ease of a man who'd seen this transformation 100 times before. "He was younger than my brother. He was trying to kill you. I know. But you wish you could have saved him, talked him down, found another way." Raphael's voice was gentle but firm. "That's the luxury of civilization, Captain. The belief that every problem has a peaceful solution. Out here, sometimes the only answer is steel and speed. The boy made his choice when he raised that blade. You made yours when you didn't let him use it. Does it get easier?" Raphael was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years James couldn't imagine. "No, if you're the kind of man worth saving, it never gets easier. It just gets more familiar, like an old scar that aches in bad weather. You learn to live with it. You learn that you can carry things that would have broken you before. The human spirit is remarkably resilient, Captain. It can adapt to almost anything. That's both our greatest strength and our most terrible curse." The months that followed proved Raphael right. James adapted. He learned to board enemy ships with practiced efficiency. He learned to read weather patterns and navigate by stars obscured by clouds. He learned the complex web of alliances and grudges that governed the pirate brotherhood, learned which ports would welcome them and which would see them hanged. He learned to be two people at once. In the day during raids and battles, he was Captain Sullivan, efficient, and cold, a man who did what needed doing without hesitation. But at night, in the privacy of his cabin, he was still James' husband and father, a man who wrote letters he could never send. "My dearest Margaret," he wrote by candlelight, the ship rocking gently at anchor. "I know you think me a monster now. Perhaps you're right. But everything I do to keep a promise. Not the promise I made to Father, though God knows I think of it every day. The promise I made to 23 men who trusted me to bring them home. I will keep that promise. I will earn their freedom. And then if there's any mercy in this world, I will find a way back to you and Samuel. Even if I'm not the man who left. Even if I'm something you can't recognize anymore. I will try." He never sent these letters. They piled up in a drawer, a chronicle of his descent pages that would only bring pain if they ever reached their destination. 6 months after he'd shaken Raphael's hand, James had earned enough to pay the ransom twice over. Raphael made good on his word. They sailed to the camp where James's crew had been held not in chains but in reasonable comfort, put to work maintaining equipment and doing light labor. Tom Peterson saw James first. The boy ran across the beach, stumbling in the sand, his face split by a grin that hit James like a physical blow. "Captain, I knew you'd come. I told the others. I said Captain Sullivan would never abandon us." The other 22 men crowded around, shaking his hand, pounding his back, their gratitude a weight heavier than any anchor. Old Henry Chase had tears in his eyes. "You saved us, Captain. When the guild put out that notice, when we heard you'd turned criminal, we thought, but you did it for us. You sacrificed everything." James couldn't speak. He just nodded and distributed the pay. Raphael had agreed to generous shares that would let each man start fresh wherever they chose. "Come on, lads," Tom called. "Captain's taking us home back to Boston." The silence that followed was deafening. James looked at their faces and understood. These men, these 23 souls he'd damned himself to save, had changed too. 6 months in the Caribbean, hearing stories of pirate wealth, seeing the freedom of life outside civilization's rules had planted seeds of temptation. "Actually, Captain," Henry Chase said carefully, not meeting James's eyes, "some of us have been talking. Raphael, he's offered us berths on his crew. Says we can sign articles, be brothers of the coast, equal shares and all." "You can't be serious. You want to become pirates after everything. After everything you did to save us." "Yeah." Tom Peterson stepped forward. The boy had hardened in 6 months. His eyes had lost their innocent brightness. "You showed us the truth, Captain. That the honest life is a trap. Work yourself to death for pennies while merchants get rich off your labor. You broke out. You showed us the way." "That's not what James stopped. What could he say? That he'd done it out of duty, not desire, that he hated every moment. They wouldn't believe him. Why should they, when he'd become so proficient at violence, when he'd adapted so completely to this life? In the end, 17 of his 23 crewmen signed Raphael's articles. Only 6 chose to go home. James paid their passage from his own share and watched the ship carry them north toward a life he could never reclaim. Tom Peterson found him that night, sitting alone on the beach. "Captain, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for saving us, for showing us there was another way." "Tom, listen to me. This life, it's not freedom, it's just another kind of cage. Don't Don't what? Don't take the chance to be something more than a wage slave. Don't grab at the only real choice I'll ever get." Tom's young face was earnest, almost pitying. "You risked everything for us, for your principles, but you didn't do it because we asked you to, Captain. You did it for your pride, to prove you were the kind of man your father taught you to be. We never asked you to sacrifice yourself." The words hit like a cannonball, because they were true. James had told himself he was acting for his crew, but that was only part of it. He'd also been proving something to himself, to his father's ghosts, to the universe. And in doing so, he'd led 23 men into the same darkness that was consuming him. That realization changed something in James. If his sacrifice hadn't saved them, if they'd chosen this life willingly, then what had it all been for? The theft, the exile, the blood on his hands, all of it meaningless if the men he'd saved didn't want saving. He started sending money home. Not the letters, those stayed locked in his drawer, but money. Substantial sums transferred through smugglers and corrupt merchants, laundered through enough intermediaries that it couldn't be traced back to piracy. He told himself it was for Samuel, for his son's future. But it was also penance, a way of bleeding out the guilt one coin at a time. Through those same smugglers, he received occasional news. Margaret had sold the house after the scandal. She was living with her sister, working as a seamstress. Samuel was growing thriving despite his father's disgrace. The Merchants Guild had never recovered the stolen money. They'd given up looking for James Sullivan, declared him lost at sea, moved on. The years blurred together. 1708 became 1710, became 1713. James stopped counting raids and started counting scars, each one a story of survival, a moment where death had come close and passed him by. He watched men join the crew and die in battles or storms or from disease. He learned that life at sea was cheap, that most pirates didn't last 5 years, that the romantic notion of freedom on the high seas was a lie told by corpses. And then in 1713, there was a letter, not from Margaret, but from a smuggler who'd been delivering James's money for years. The man's name was Robertson, a Scottish merchant who traded in information and questionable goods, who asked no questions as long as the payment was good. Captain Robertson wrote, "Thought you should know. The money you've been sending, Mrs. Sullivan donated most of it. She's been supporting families in need, widows, orphans, people fallen on hard times. She kept enough for herself and the boy to live modestly, but the rest went to charity. Everyone in Boston knows her as a saint. They've forgotten you were ever her husband. Thought you'd want to know what's being done with your blood money. Make of it what you will." James read the letter 3 times, then burned it. But the words stayed with him. Margaret had taken his crimes and turned them into mercy. His stolen money earned through violence and theft was feeding hungry children. The mathematics of morality had inverted, somehow become so complex that he could no longer calculate right from wrong. That same year, Raphael called the crew together on the beach of a nameless island. They'd been hunting British merchantmen for weeks, but the normally unflappable Spanish captain seemed troubled. "Gentlemen," Raphael said, his voice carrying across the assembled men, "I've received an offer from the British Crown. A pardon for all past crimes if we cease our activities and pledge loyalty to King George." The crew erupted in questions and curses. Raphael raised his hand for silence. "I'm 53 years old," he continued. "I've been at sea since I was 12. I've fought in more battles than I can count. I've killed more men than I care to remember. And I'm tired." He looked directly at James. "Captain Sullivan, you taught me something. You showed me that a man can keep his principles even in this life, that we don't have to be the monsters they say we are. I'm taking the pardon. I'm going home." "You're leaving." James felt something crack inside him. Raphael had been his anchor, the moral compass in a world without north. "I'm choosing life over death, old friend, and I'd advise you to do the same. You're 33 years old. You've earned enough to live modestly for the rest of your days. Take the pardon, go home to your wife and son while you still can. But James couldn't. The wanted notices for his original crimes, the theft from the guild, those wouldn't be covered by a pirate pardon. Going home meant prison or hanging. And even if he could go back, what would he say to Margaret, to Samuel, who was 11 now, who wouldn't even remember his father's face? So he watched Raphael sail away toward redemption, and he stayed. The crew elected James captain by unanimous vote. He accepted not out of ambition, but out of inertia, because he had nowhere else to go, nothing else to be. Captain Sullivan, pirate and outlaw, was all that remained of the man who'd been James. Under his command, the crew took 23 ships in 3 years, exactly 23, one for each man he'd tried to save. It felt significant somehow, a twisted kind of symmetry. But with each prize, each battle, each act of violence necessary to survive, James felt himself hollowing out, becoming a shell with nothing inside but forward momentum. His letters to Margaret stopped. What was there to say anymore? That he'd become exactly what the wanted posters claimed, that he'd lost count of the men he'd killed, that he could feel his father's ghost watching him with eternal disappointment. In 1716, another letter reached him. This one was from Margaret herself, somehow smuggled to a port where she knew his contacts operated. How she'd learned about his network, James never discovered. But there it was, her handwriting slightly shaky now on paper that smelled faintly of lavender. James, it began, not my dearest, not my love, just his name stripped of affection. I'm writing to tell you that I'm remarrying. His name is Robert Patterson. He's a good man, a colonial officer, respectable and kind. Samuel needs a father. Not the ghost of one, not money that arrives mysteriously in the night, but a real father who comes home every evening and teaches him how to be a man. I don't know if you're alive to read this. I don't know if you even care. But I owed you honesty even if you never gave it to me. Samuel stopped asking about you 3 years ago. He calls Robert father now. He's happy. We're happy. I forgive you for leaving. I forgive you for the crime you committed. I even forgive you for never coming back. But I can't forgive you for making me wait for a man who was already gone. So I'm letting you go, James. I'm choosing life. I hope wherever you are, you can do the same. Goodbye. The letter wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. James folded it carefully, placed it with the others in his drawer, and walked up on deck. His crew was celebrating their latest prize, drinking rum and singing songs about freedom and brotherhood. They didn't notice him slip over the rail into the dark water below. The Caribbean at night was warm and infinite. James floated on his back, staring up at stars he'd used for navigation 1,000 times, and felt the weight of his years trying to pull him down. It would be easy to just let go, to sink into the dark water and let the sea have him the way it had claimed so many of his crew over the years. But even that was a choice he couldn't make. Because somewhere in some part of himself he couldn't kill, there was still a man who'd sworn an oath over his father's deathbed. A man who believed that your word was your bond, that honor meant something even when it cost you everything, especially when it cost you everything. A hand grabbed his collar and hauled him back to the surface. Tom Peterson, no longer a boy, but a hardened pirate of 24, dragged him to the ship and pulled him aboard. Captain, what the hell? Leave me alone, Tom. Not a chance, sir. Tom's grip was iron. You saved my life once. Turnabout's fair play. You should have let me drown. Probably, but then who'd keep us from becoming the monsters everyone thinks we are? Tom hauled James to his feet. You're the only thing standing between this crew and total savagery, Captain. We need you, even if you don't need yourself anymore. James looked at this young man. He'd inadvertently corrupted this boy he'd led into darkness while trying to save him, and saw something he hadn't expected. Loyalty. Not the blind obedience of a sailor to his captain, but genuine care. Tom Peterson, despite everything, had become his friend. How did you know, James asked, that I was... Because I see that look in the mirror every morning, Captain. The look of a man wondering what he's become. The difference is you haven't stopped fighting it. And as long as you keep fighting, the rest of us have a chance. James returned to his cabin and read Margaret's letter one more time. Then he burned it, watching the paper curl and blacken, watching his last connection to his old life turn to ash. She'd chosen to live. She'd chosen Robert Patterson and stability and a future that didn't include waiting for a dead man to return. He could honor that choice. He could let her go. But he couldn't go home. Not yet. maybe not ever. So he became the thing the world had made him. Captain Sullivan Scourge of the British merchant fleet, the pirate who never killed unnecessarily but never hesitated when killing was required. His reputation grew. Merchants feared his black flag. Naval officers spoke his name with grudging respect. In the taverns of Nassau and Tortuga, men told stories of the pirate with the conscience the outlaw, who somehow maintained honor in a dishonorable profession. But in his cabin alone with his letters and his ghosts, James Sullivan counted the cost of that honor. Every ship he took, every man he killed, every year that passed without seeing his son's face. In 1717, Don Rafael de Silva died in his sleep in Seville, pardoned and respected, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew he had been a pirate. James received the news from a mutual contact and felt something break that had been cracking for years. Raphael had escaped. He'd found his way back to civilization, to peace, to a life with meaning beyond survival. And James was still out here, still fighting and still unable to find the exit from the maze he'd entered 10 years ago. That night, he wrote his last letter to Margaret. My dearest, it began falling back into old habits, old affections that no longer had anywhere to land. I heard you remarried. I'm happy for you. That. Samuel deserves better than what I could give him, better than what I became. I tried to be the man father wanted. I swore an oath that I thought meant something. But oaths are just words, and words are just air, unless they're backed by action. I acted. I sacrificed everything. And it meant nothing because the men I saved didn't want saving, and the family I loved moved on without me. So what was it all for? What did any of it mean? I don't know anymore. All I know is that I'm still here, still fighting, still trying to be something I'm not sure exists. An honorable criminal, a pirate with principles, a man who broke every rule except the ones that matter, except I can't remember anymore which ones those are. If Samuel ever asks about me, tell him his father tried. Tell him I kept my promises even when it destroyed me. Tell him that honor is a knife that cuts both ways, and sometimes the wielder bleeds more than the victim. And tell him I'm sorry for everything. He put this letter with the others. 63 letters now, a decade of confession and regret, none of them ever sent. They were a record of a dead man, proof that James Sullivan had existed, even if Captain Sullivan was all that remained. The years were taking their toll. At 37, James felt 60. His hands had developed a tremor from old injuries poorly healed. His sleep was fragmented by nightmares of the men he'd killed, the lives he'd destroyed. He drank more than was wise and smiled less than was healthy. His crew worried about him. Tom Peterson especially, who'd appointed himself James's unofficial guardian, watching for signs of the despair that claimed so many pirates in the end. Captain, Tom said one evening as they sat watching the sun set over water, the color of blood, we've been at this 12 years. We've earned enough to live like kings. Maybe it's time to think about an endgame. Raphael found his way out. Maybe we can too. Raphael didn't have a price on his head for stealing from his own people. True, but he also didn't have a son waiting for him, and Samuel's 14 now. In a few years, he'll be a man. Don't you want to know him before it's too late? James thought about Samuel, who'd been 4 when he left, and was now older than some of the boys on his crew. Samuel, who called another man father, who was learning to be a colonial officer, who would probably hunt pirates when he grew up. Samuel, who wouldn't recognize James if they passed on the street. It's already too late, Tom. Then make it not too late. Figure it out. You're the smartest man I know, Captain. If anyone can find a way back from hell, it's you. But there was no way back. James knew this with the certainty of mathematics, the cold logic that had first set him on this path. He'd crossed too many lines, burned too many bridges. The only direction left was forward deeper into the darkness until the darkness swallowed him completely, or the British Navy finally caught up. In 1720, the universe offered him one more test, one more chance to prove whether any shred of the man he'd been still existed. They raided a ship flying British colors, unremarkable except for riding high in the water, which meant valuable cargo. Probably luxury goods or specie. The boarding was routine. The crew surrendered without a fight, and then James went below to inventory the prize. The hold didn't contain silk or silver or anything they could sell. It contained children. 73 orphans, ages 6 to 14, being transported from London to the Boston orphanage. War orphans, street urchins, the forgotten children of the empire being shipped to the colonies for a fresh start. In the captain's cabin, James found a manifest with their names and faces sketched beside each entry. And there, third from the top, was a boy named Samuel Patterson, age 12, brown hair, slight build, being sent to family in Boston. It wasn't his Samuel, the manifest made that clear. This was a distant relation of Robert Patterson, the man who'd married Margaret, who'd become the father James had failed to be. But the portrait looked like his son had looked at 12, the same serious eyes, the same solemn expression. James stood in that cabin for 3 minutes, staring at that portrait while his crew waited above for orders. 3 minutes where the weight of 12 years crashed down on him like a rogue wave, threatening to pull him under and drown him in the realization of what he'd become. He could rob this ship, take what little the orphanage had given for supplies, leave the children unharmed but traumatized. It would be within the code he'd established the rules he'd set for himself. No killing, no cruelty, just theft. Or he could let them go. But letting them go meant admitting that his entire life's path had been wrong. That the oath he'd broken, the family he'd abandoned, the crimes he'd committed, all of it had been for nothing. That there was no honor in what he'd become, no principle worth defending, no code that made him better than the monsters he'd sworn never to be. James walked back on deck. His crew watched him, reading his face, seeing something there that made even hardened pirates shift nervously. "Let them go," James said quietly. "Captain," Tom Peterson stepped forward. "The cargo? Let them go." James's voice was steel. "Give them fresh water, fresh provisions, anything they need. And if any man on this crew so much as speaks harshly to a child, I'll kill him myself." The crew obeyed, confused but loyal. They provisioned the ship, repaired a damaged mast, even gave the frightened captain navigation charts to ensure safe passage. And then they watched the orphan ship sail away toward Boston, toward a future those children deserved, a future James had thrown away. That night, James Sullivan, the pirate, died for the second time. And this time there was nothing left to replace him. He sat in his cabin, pulled out the 63 letters he'd never sent, and read them all. A decade of confession, regret, justification, pain. A decade of trying to explain the inexplicable, to justify the unjustifiable. And at the end of it all, he had nothing to show but the ghost of the man he'd been and the monster he'd become. Tom found him at dawn, still sitting with the letters spread around him like accusations. "Captain," Tom said gently, "we need to talk about what happens next." "I know what happens next, Tom. The British Navy has been closing in for months. Woody's Rogers is offering pardons to pirates who surrender. It's over. So we take the pardon. Start fresh. You can go home." James laughed, a broken sound. "Home to what?" "To a wife who's remarried, to a son who doesn't know me, to a wanted notice that's still waiting because the pardon doesn't cover crimes committed before I became a pirate. There is no home, Tom. There never was. I destroyed it the moment I pried open that strong box. Then what? We just keep running until they hang us." "No." James stood, decisions settling over him like armor. "We scuttle the ships, divide the treasure. Every man chooses for himself. Those who want the pardon can take it. Those who want to disappear, I'll help them. But I won't lead anyone else into darkness. Not anymore. And you, I'm going to do something I should have done 12 years ago. I'm going to face what I've done. I'm going to go home and accept the consequences, even if they hang me for it. Because that oath I swore to my father, the one I broke the moment I needed it most, it still means something. Honor still means something, even if I'm the only one who believes it." Tom stared at him for a long moment. Then quietly, "I'm coming with you." "Tom, no. You've got your whole life. You saved me when I was 16, Captain. You've been saving me every day since, keeping me from becoming the kind of pirate I'd have been under anyone else. So yeah, I'm coming with you. Someone's got to watch your back. Someone's got to make sure you actually make it home instead of doing something stupid and noble." James tried to argue, but Tom was as stubborn as the boy he'd once been. In the end, 32 men chose to scatter into the Caribbean with their shares. 20 accepted the pardon. And James and Tom, pointed their small sloop north toward Boston and the reckoning that waited there. As they sailed, James took his 63 unsent letters and dropped them one by one into the sea. They floated on the surface for a moment before the ink began to run, before the paper dissolved, before the ocean swallowed his confessions like it had swallowed so many other secrets. Margaret was right. He'd already chosen. He'd chosen this life, this path, these consequences. The only question left was whether he'd face them with the honor his father had taught him or run from them like the criminal he'd become. For the first time in 12 years, the answer was clear. He was going home. Boston in autumn of 1722 looked exactly as James remembered, and nothing like it at all. The buildings were the same, the harbor still smelled of salt and fish and commerce. The church bells still rang at the same hours. But he was different, fundamentally altered in ways that made the familiar feel alien. He stood on the wharf in clothes stolen from a merchant's wash line, watching Margaret's old house, the one they'd sold after his crime. A new family lived there now. Children played in the yard where Samuel had played as a boy. Life had moved on, as it always does, leaving no trace of the man who'd once called that place home. Tom Peterson touched his elbow. "We should move. Harbor master might recognize you." "He won't. I'm 16 years older and 30 pounds lighter. I look like 100 other sailors." "You look like a ghost captain. Come on, we need to find somewhere to stay while we plan this out." They took a room at a boarding house near the docks, paying cash and giving false names. James spent the first night just walking the streets of his former home, cataloging the changes. New shops, new faces, but the bones of the city remained. And somewhere in this city was his son. Samuel Patterson, as he was known now. Age 20, attending the Naval Academy, training to become an officer in His Majesty's service. James had learned this much from careful questions to the boarding house keeper, an older woman who loved gossip and asked few questions in return. The Patterson boy. Oh yes, fine young man, takes after his father, the colonial officer. Not his real father, mind you. His birth father was that criminal, the one who robbed the guild and ran off. But you'd never know it to look at him. Respectable as they come. James absorbed this information like a knife to the gut. His son was respectable. His son had overcome the scandal of his birth. His son had made something of himself, despite or perhaps because of his father's absence. 3 days of surveillance later, James saw him. Samuel Patterson walked across the academy courtyard in a cadet's uniform, carrying books, laughing with friends. He was tall, taller than James, with Margaret's dark hair and James's own serious eyes. 20 years old and impossibly grown, a man James had never known. "He looks like you," Tom whispered from their hiding spot across the street. "He looks like himself, like someone who never needed me." But fate, as it always does, had other plans. James had been careful, meticulous in his surveillance. What he hadn't counted on was the compass. His father's compass, the one Raphael had returned to him 16 years ago. The one he'd carried through every raid and battle and dark night of the soul. He dropped it. A simple accident, pulling out coins to pay for coffee at a shop near the academy. The compass fell, rolled across the floor, and came to rest at the feet of a young cadet who just entered. Samuel picked it up, examined it. His face went pale as he read the initials carved into the brass. J.S. James Sullivan. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Father and son, stranger and stranger, separated by 16 years, and a gulf of crimes that couldn't be explained or forgiven. James saw recognition dawn in Samuel's eyes, saw the shock and anger and confusion chase each other across his face. Then Samuel's hand went to the pistol at his belt. "Don't," James said quietly. "Please, just let me walk away." "You're James Sullivan." Samuel's voice was steady, but his hand trembled. "The pirate, the thief, my father." "I was your father. I'm not sure what I am anymore." "You're a wanted man." Samuel's fingers tightened on the pistol grip. "I should arrest you. I should call the guard right now." "You should. You'd be doing your duty." "Then why don't you run? Why are you just standing there?" James looked at his son, this man he'd never known, and felt the weight of 16 years settle on his shoulders. "Because I'm tired of running, Samuel. Because you deserve answers even if you can't forgive me. Because I came back not to hide, but to face what I've done." They stood frozen for an eternal moment. Other patrons in the coffee shop watched with growing alarm. Someone would call the authorities soon. This confrontation would end in arrest or violence, or both. "Outside," Samuel said finally. "Now, we're not doing this here." They walked to a quiet corner of the shipyard, Tom following at a distance. Samuel kept his hand on his pistol but didn't draw it. When they were alone, he turned on James with barely controlled fury. 16 years. You left for 16 years. Mother cried herself to sleep for the first 3. I learned to stop asking about you after 5. And now you just show up like it's nothing, like you have any right to be here. I don't have any rights. I know that. I'm a criminal. I stole from the guild. I became a pirate. I killed men who didn't deserve to die. I don't expect forgiveness. Then what do you expect? Why come back at all? James pulled out the stack of letters he'd reconstructed from memory, the confessions he'd written and rewritten through sleepless nights on the voyage north. I came back to give you the truth. Everything I did, everything I became, it's all here. You can read it or burn it. You can turn me in or let me go. But you deserve to know who your father really was. Not the monster from the wanted posters. Not the saint your mother tried to make me. Just the man who made impossible choices and paid for every one of them. Samuel stared at the letters. I don't want your confessions. I want to know why. Why steal? Why leave? Why become everything grandfather taught you to hate? Because 23 men were going to die if I didn't get $10,000 in 6 months. Because the only way to get that money was to become the thing I hated most. Because I thought honor meant keeping your word, no matter the key, and I was wrong. Honor isn't about grand gestures and impossible sacrifices. It's about being there for the people who need you, for your family, and I failed at that completely. The money, Samuel said slowly. Mother donated most of it, to orphanages, to widows, to families in need. She turned your blood money into mercy. I know. She's a better person than I ever was. She married father when I was 14. Robert Patterson, the colonial officer. He's been good to me, better than you ever were. I'm glad, truly. You deserved a father who was there. Samuel's anger seemed to deflate, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. He was too young to look so tired, but James recognized that weariness. It was the look of someone carrying a weight they never asked for. What do you want from me? Samuel asked. Forgiveness, absolution. I can't give you that. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know that I tried. That every choice I made, no matter how terrible I made, because I thought it was right. I was wrong about almost everything, but I tried. You should turn yourself in, face trial, if you're really trying to make this right. I will. That's why I came back. To face the consequences finally. To stop running. Samuel studied him for a long moment. You look old and sick. What happened to you out there? Life, death, everything in between. The sea takes its toll, Samuel. On body and soul both. Do you regret it, any of it? James thought about Raphael and Tom and the men he'd saved who'd chosen piracy anyway. He thought about the ships he'd taken and the orphans he'd spared. He thought about Margaret's letters and his father's oath and the impossible calculus of morality. I regret leaving you, everything else. I did what I thought I had to do. Whether that makes me a good man or a bad one, I honestly don't know anymore. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a watch. James recognized it immediately, his father's watch passed down through generations that he'd left behind when he fled Boston. Mother gave this to me when I turned 18, said it belonged to my grandfather, that he'd have wanted me to have it. Samuel held it out. Take it. Consider it payment for the money you sent. We're even now, no debts. Samuel. We're even, Samuel repeated firmly, and when you turn yourself in, I won't testify against you. But I won't testify for you either. You made your choices. Now live with them. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. I have a sister now. Robert and Mother had a daughter last year. Her name is Margaret after Mother. She'll never know you. She'll grow up thinking Robert is her real father and you're just a cautionary tale. And that's how it should be. Some ghosts should stay buried. James watched his son walk away, carrying himself with the straight-back pride of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Everything James had wanted to be, Samuel had become. Without him, because of him, despite him, the mathematics were too complex to calculate. Tom appeared at his elbow. That went better than I expected. He didn't shoot you. He didn't need to. I was already dead. So what now? Now I go to the colonial magistrate. I confess everything, and I accept whatever judgment they pass. You know they'll hang you. Probably, but at least I'll die as myself, as James Sullivan, not Captain Sullivan. That counts for something. The trial of James Sullivan became the scandal of the season. The courtroom was packed with merchants seeking justice, former victims seeking revenge, and curious citizens seeking entertainment. James stood in the dock wearing the stolen sailor's clothes he'd arrived in, looking every inch the broken pirate the prosecution painted him to be. The charges were read: grand theft from the Merchants Guild, conspiracy, piracy on the high seas, murder of British subjects. The list went on, a catalog of crimes spanning 16 years. James pled guilty to everything. The prosecution, led by a young lawyer named Williams, seemed almost disappointed by this. He'd prepared a spectacular case with witnesses and evidence and dramatic revelations. The defendant's confession robbed him of his moment. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge said, "you understand that by pleading guilty to these charges, you face execution." "I do, Your Honor." "And you make this plea freely without coercion?" "I do." The judge frowned. "I must say this is highly irregular. Most men in your position would at least attempt a defense." "I have no defense, Your Honor. I did everything they say I did. I stole from the guild to ransom my crew. I became a pirate to earn money I couldn't earn honestly. I killed men who stood between me and survival. These are facts. The only question is whether there were reasons that might make them understandable, if not forgivable." "And you believe there were such reasons?" James looked at Samuel sitting in the gallery, his face carefully neutral. "I believe there were. I was wrong." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, given the defendant's confession, we see no need for a lengthy trial. The sentence for these crimes is clear." "Indeed." The judge raised his gavel. "James Sullivan, you have confessed to crimes that warrant your honor, if I may." Everyone turned. Samuel Patterson stood in the gallery, his cadet uniform immaculate, his voice clear. "I have information relevant to this case." The judge gestured for him to approach. Samuel walked to the witness stand with measured steps, was sworn in, and faced the courtroom. "State your name and relationship to the defendant." "Samuel Patterson, Cadet, Royal Naval Academy. I am the defendant's biological son." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Patterson, what information do you have?" Samuel pulled out a ledger from his coat. "This is a record of donations made to the Boston Charitable Fund over the past 14 years. The total amount is $62,000. Every penny was donated anonymously, but my mother, Margaret Patterson, administered the distribution." He handed the ledger to the judge. "That money fed 300 families. It funded the construction of an orphanage. It paid for medical care for 200 children. It established a fund for widows of sailors lost at sea. All of this came from the money James Sullivan sent home. Money he earned as a pirate." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Your Honor, blood money is still blood. The source of those funds doesn't change the crimes committed to acquire them." "I'm not disputing the crimes," Samuel said calmly. "I'm providing context. James Sullivan became a criminal to save his crew. He stayed a criminal to support charitable works. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking for the full truth to be known." "Why?" The judge leaned forward. "Why would you testify for a man who abandoned you?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Because he's still my father. Because despite everything he tried, and because if we're going to judge him, we should judge the whole man, not just the crime." A commotion at the back of the courtroom interrupted him. An older man pushed through the crowd, naval uniform glittering with medals and authority. Robert Patterson, colonial officer Samuel's stepfather. He walked to the witness stand and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Your Honor, I'd like to add to my son's testimony. I investigated James Sullivan's pirate activities thoroughly when he first appeared in these waters. I wanted to know what kind of man had fathered my stepson." He pulled out a folder of documents. In 16 years of piracy, James Sullivan attacked 47 British vessels. Of those 47, he never killed a single sailor who surrendered. He never attacked ships carrying women or children. He released 18 captured sailors who had families, giving them money to get home. He personally interceded to prevent the execution of 7 men captured by other pirates, buying their freedom with his own share of plunder. Patterson looked directly at James. I hated you. I hated what you did to Margaret and Samuel. But I also had to admit that if we're judging pirates, you were the most honorable criminal he ever investigated. You kept your conscience in a profession that has none. That should count for something. The judge examined the documents. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of his pen as he made notes. This is most irregular, he finally said. The law is clear on the penalties for piracy, and yet, he looked at James with something that might have been respect. James Sullivan, you have committed crimes that normally warrant death by hanging. However, given the testimony, presented the charitable work funded by your activities, and your evident remorse, I'm prepared to offer an alternative sentence. He paused. 20 years hard labor in the Jamaican work camps. Eligible for parole after 10 years if you demonstrate continued good behavior and remorse. The courtroom erupted. The merchants in attendance shouted their outrage. The prosecutor objected vehemently, but the judge's gavel silenced them all. This is my ruling. James Sullivan, you will serve your sentence, and perhaps in that service, you will find the redemption you have been seeking. May God have mercy on your soul. They led James away in chains. As he passed Samuel in the gallery, their eyes met one final time. Thank you, James whispered. Samuel didn't respond, but as James was taken through the door, he thought he saw his son nod just slightly. Acknowledgement if not forgiveness. Recognition if not redemption. It was more than he deserved. Jamaica was hell in the daylight. The work camps where James was sent were plantations and all but named convicts, laboring under the Caribbean sun to harvest sugarcane that would sweeten the tea of empire. The work was backbreaking, the conditions brutal, the mortality rate high. James worked alongside murderers and thieves, rapists and deserters, men who'd committed crimes far worse than his, and men whose only crime was poverty. They worked from dawn to dusk, ate thin gruel and hard bread, slept in barracks that stank of sweat and despair. And somehow James found peace. Not happiness, not forgiveness, but a kind of peace that came from finally paying the price, from accepting consequences instead of running from them. Every morning he woke to pain and labor. Every night he fell into exhausted sleep. And slowly, day by day, the weight he'd been carrying for 16 years began to lighten. Tom Peterson was in the next work camp over having insisted on confessing to piracy alongside James. They saw each other once a month when the camps gathered for supplies. Tom had aged badly in the first year, the work nearly killing him. But he survived, stubborn as always. Still think this was better than hanging? Tom asked during one of their brief meetings. Yes, James said without hesitation, because this is earning something. Every day I work, every drop of sweat, it's paying back what I stole. Not just the money, the years, the trust, everything. You're insane, Captain. Probably, but it's too late to change now. 3 years into his sentence, James received a letter. The handwriting was familiar, despite the years. Margaret's slightly shakier now, but still elegant. James, it began. I heard about the trial, about Samuel's testimony, about your sentence. I should have written sooner, but I didn't know what to say. I still don't. Robert tells me you saved 17 men, that you funded the orphanage where my daughter now volunteers, that you kept some spark of decency in a profession that has none. I don't know if that makes you a good man who did bad things or a bad man who did some good. Maybe it doesn't matter. Samuel asks about you sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. He wants to understand. I think he's trying to reconcile the father who left with the man who came back. It's hard for him. It's hard for all of us. I don't forgive you. I don't think I ever will. But I don't hate you either. Somewhere between those two extremes, there's a space where I can acknowledge that you tried. You failed, but you tried. And perhaps that's all any of us can do. There's a chaplain at your camp, Father O'Brien. I've asked him to check on you occasionally, to make sure you're not dying in obscurity. Not out of love, but out of duty. You're still Samuel's own father, even if you never were his dad. That connection doesn't break no matter how much we wish it would. Stay alive, James. Serve your time. And maybe when you've paid your debt, there might be a place for you in this world again. Not with me. That door is closed. But somewhere. Margaret James read the letter until the words blurred, then carefully folded it and placed it in his few possessions. Father O'Brien did come, a kind Irish priest who brought books and conversation, who listened to James's confession not as a judge, but as a fellow human trying to make sense of a senseless world. Do you believe in redemption, Father James asked during one visit? I believe in grace, my son, which is not quite the same thing. Redemption implies you can earn back what you lost. Grace means accepting that you can't and being given mercy anyway. I don't deserve mercy. None of us do. That's what makes it grace. 5 years into his sentence, Samuel visited. He came in his lieutenant's uniform, officially inspecting the work camps, unofficially seeking his father. They sat across from each other in the camp's visiting area, two strangers connected by blood and history. You look healthier, Samuel said. I expected worse. Hard work agrees with me, or maybe I'm just too stubborn to die. Mother sends her regards, and this. He pushed a small package across the table. Inside was a daguerreotype, the new photography that was sweeping the colonies. It showed Margaret, older but still beautiful, standing beside Robert Patterson. And in front of them, a young girl of perhaps 4 with dark curls and a serious expression. My sister, Samuel said. Little Margaret. Mother thought you should know what she looks like. James studied the image with hands that trembled despite his best efforts. She looks like you did at that age. I know, it's strange, isn't it? How genetics persist despite everything. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Samuel spoke again. I'm getting married next spring. Anne Winthrop Merchant's daughter. Good family. Mother approves. Congratulations. I'm happy for you. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you're still my father, whether either of us likes it or not. And you should know these things. Samuel the first. Don't. Samuel held up his hand. Don't apologize again. Don't explain again. Just listen. You've got 5 more years if you make parole. When you get out, there's a job waiting for you. Robert has connections in the shipbuilding trade. You'll work as a carpenter's assistant. Nothing glamorous, but honest work. A chance to start over. Why would he do that? Because he's a better man than either of us. And because he knows I need to make peace with you eventually. This is the first step. Samuel stood to leave. I won't visit again. It's too hard. But I needed you to know you're not forgotten. You're not forgiven either. But you're not forgotten. The remaining 5 years passed in a blur of labor and reflection. James worked read the books Father O'Brien brought and slowly let go of the man he'd been. The pirate, the criminal, the desperate father trying to fix the unfixable faded into memory. In their place emerged someone simpler. Just James. Just a man who'd made terrible choices and was paying for them. Nothing more. Nothing less. In 1728, at 48 years old, James Sullivan walked out of the Jamaican work camp a free man. His hair was gray, his body lean and scarred, his hands calloused from 5 years of hard labor on top of 16 years of pirate life. But his eyes were clearer than they'd been in decades. Tom Peterson was waiting for him at the gate, released 6 months earlier, looking healthier than he had in years. Captain, Tom said with his old grin, ready to rejoin the world. Don't call me captain. That man's dead. Fair enough. James it is. Come on. We've got a ship to catch. Boston's waiting. They sailed north on a merchant vessel, honest passengers paying honest fares. James spent the voyage watching the sea that had been his prison and his home, saying goodbye to the life he'd lived on these waters. He'd never sail again, he knew. The sea had taken enough from him. Boston welcomed them with indifference. The city had moved on from the scandal of James Sullivan. New crimes, new gossip, new dramas had replaced his story. He was just another ex-convict now, notable only for how thoroughly he'd fallen. Robert Patterson kept his word. There was a bufum at a shipyard building the vessels James had once hunted. The work was hard but satisfying in a way piracy never had been. He was creating instead of destroying, building instead of stealing. He took a room in a boarding house near the harbor, cheap but clean. Tom lived 2 streets over, working at the same shipyard. They'd survived together, 2 men who'd walked through hell and somehow made it back. Samuel didn't visit, but Margaret did once 2 months after James's return. She appeared at the shipyard on a Tuesday afternoon, older but still carrying herself with the dignity that had first drawn James to her 3 decades before. She watched him work for several minutes before he noticed her. When he did, he froze, plane in hand, not sure what to do or say. Margaret, he finally managed. James, She walked closer, examining his work. You're good at this. Better than I expected. I had a good teacher. My father was the finest carpenter in Boston before he went to sea. I remember. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not here to reconcile. I want to be clear about that. Robert is my husband. He's been more of a husband in 12 years than you were in the 3 we had together. I know. I don't expect. Let me finish. Her voice was firm. I'm here because Samuel asked me to come. He's getting married next month, and he wants you there. Not in the church, that's too much, but at the reception, briefly, Robert agreed to it. Samuel wants me at his wedding. He wants to introduce you to his bride as his biological father. He wants her to know the whole truth, not the sanitized version. He's building a marriage on honesty, and that means acknowledging all the messy parts of his history. James felt something crack in his chest. I'd be honored. Don't make me regret this. Don't make him regret this. You get 1 hour. You shake hands. You meet Anne. You congratulate them, and then you leave. Clean, simple, no drama. I understand. Margaret turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, Father O'Brien wrote to me regularly during your sentence. He said you changed, that you found something like peace. I don't know if I believe that, but I hope it's true for your sake. It is true. I'm not the man I was, Margaret. Better or worse, I can't say, but different. Good. Different is the only thing that makes this possible. Samuel's wedding was beautiful, held in the church where James and Margaret had married 30 years before. James stood in the back during the ceremony, watching his son pledge his life to a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Anne Winthrop, soon to be Anne Patterson, who looked at Samuel like he was her whole world. At the reception, Samuel brought her over to meet James. Tom had helped him buy decent clothes, taught him the proper etiquette for such occasions, but nothing prepared him for the moment his son said, Anne, this is James Sullivan, my biological father. Anne didn't flinch. She extended her hand with genuine warmth. Mr. Sullivan, I'm pleased to meet you. Samuel's told me about you. About everything. I'm sorry for any pain my history has caused. The past is past, Mr. Sullivan. What matters is the future. And Samuel assures me you're part of that future in whatever small way you can be. They talked for exactly 1 hour. James met Robert Patterson, shook the hand of the man who'd been the father he couldn't be. They spoke briefly about the shipbuilding work, about Boston's growth, about anything except the years that lay between them, like an ocean. Little Margaret was there 7 now, holding her mother's hand and staring at James with curious eyes. Is this the pirate grandfather? She asked loudly. The whole room went quiet. Samuel looked mortified, but James just knelt down to her level. I was a pirate, yes, but I'm not anymore. Now I'm just a carpenter who made a lot of mistakes and is trying to do better. Did you have a sword? I did. Did you kill people? Margaret, her mother gasped, but James held up his hand. It's okay. She deserves honesty. He looked at the little girl. Yes, I killed people. It's the worst thing I ever did, and I regret it every day. That's why I'm not a pirate anymore, because hurting people is wrong no matter what the reason. Oh, she thought about this. Can I call you Grandfather James? The room held its breath. James felt his eyes burn. I'd like that very much. When his hour was up, James left quietly. Samuel walked him to the door. Thank you for coming. I know it wasn't easy. Thank you for inviting me. It means more than you know. Anne's pregnant. Samuel said it quietly. We just found out. We're not telling people yet, but I wanted you to know. You're going to be a grandfather. James couldn't speak. He just nodded, not trusting his voice. We'd like you to be part of the child's life. Not a lot, but some. Visits on birthdays. That sort of thing, if you want. I'd like that very much. They shook hands and James walked out into the Boston night. Tom was waiting for him at their usual tavern. How'd it go? I have a grandson coming. Or granddaughter, they don't know yet. Tom raised his mug. To new beginnings. To paying old debts, James countered. Same thing, isn't it? Maybe it was. The years that followed were quiet. James worked his job, attended births and holidays with careful restraint, never imposing, but always present when invited. Samuel's daughter was born in 1729, a healthy baby they named William after James's father. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Your grandfather's name lives on, Samuel said, placing the baby in James's arms for the first time. Maybe that means something. Maybe it means the oath you swore wasn't completely broken. James looked at this tiny life, this new generation, and felt the weight of decades lift slightly. William Sullivan Patterson, a name that connected past to present, that acknowledged both the family heritage and the new family that had formed in the broken spaces. Margaret softened over time, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. She'd attend the same gatherings as James, speak to him with cool politeness that gradually warmed to something almost like friendship. Robert, generous soul that he was, made it possible. He never saw James as a threat, only as a sad remnant of a life Margaret had survived. In 1732, Robert Patterson died of pneumonia. He was 54, still vital, still active in colonial affairs. His death shook the family to its core. At the funeral, Margaret stood beside Samuel, and little Margaret stoic in her grief. James attended but stayed in the back, not wanting to intrude on their loss. But after the ceremony, Margaret found him. "Walk with me," she said. They walked to the harbor, to the spot where James's old ship used to dock, where their life together had begun so long ago. "He was a good man," Margaret said. "Better than I deserved. He was better than any of us deserved." They stood in silence, watching ships come and go, the eternal rhythm of commerce and travel, and life moving on forward. "I'm 60 now," Margaret said. "Robert's death made me realize something. I've spent 30 years being angry at you, 30 years holding on to hurt, and I'm tired. I don't have the energy for it anymore." "Margaret, I'm not saying I forgive you. I'm not even saying I understand. But I'm saying I'm done fighting. You came back. You paid your debt. You've been respectful and distant and everything I asked you to be. That's enough. It has to be enough because I don't have room in my heart for anything else." She turned to him and for the first time in 30 years looked at him without anger. "Robert left me comfortable, but I'm alone in that big house. Samuel has his own family. Little Margaret is about to be married herself, and I realize the only person who understands what I've lost is you, because you lost the same things. We just lost them in different ways." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we could be friends, not lovers, not spouses, but two old people who survived the same storm and can talk about it without rage. Would you like that?" James felt something loosen in his chest, something he had been holding tight for 3 decades. "I'd like that very much." They met for coffee once a month after that. Quiet afternoons where they'd talk about Samuel's success, William's latest milestone, little Margaret's upcoming wedding. They'd discuss books and politics and the weather, carefully avoiding the painful topics. But sometimes late in the afternoon, when the coffee had grown cold, they'd venture into that territory. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked one day. "All of it. I regret leaving you. I regret the crimes. I regret becoming someone I'm not sure my father would recognize. But I don't regret trying to save my crew. Even though it failed, even though they chose to stay pirates, I don't regret trying." That's very you, James, always focused on the intent rather than the outcome. Is that a criticism? It's an observation. You always cared more about doing what you thought was right than about whether it actually helped anyone. That's your great strength and your terrible flaw. She wasn't wrong. In 1740, little Margaret married a merchant's son and moved to Philadelphia. In 1742, Samuel became a full captain in His Majesty's Navy. William turned 13 and showed early signs of inheriting the family skill with ships and carpentry. And James, at 62, felt his body beginning to fail. The years of hard labor, the tropical diseases, the accumulated damage of a life lived hard, and all of it was catching up. He knew he didn't have long. Samuel visited him more frequently in those last months. They'd sit together in James's simple room, talking about life and legacy and the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. "William asked me about you yesterday," Samuel said during one visit. "He wanted to know if you were really a pirate." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were a man who made terrible choices for what he thought were good reasons, and that sometimes that's all any of us can do. We make choices with the information we have and the person we are at the time, and then we live with the consequences." "That's very wise." "I learned it from you, not from your words, from your life. You taught me that honor isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, about facing what you've done instead of running from it." James smiled. "I wish I'd figured that out 30 years earlier." Maybe. But maybe you had to walk that path to teach me this lesson. Maybe that's your legacy, not the crimes, not even the charity, but showing one generation what not to do so the next generation can do better. In August of 1745, James Sullivan died quietly in his sleep. He was 65 years old, ancient by the standards of his time, a minor miracle for a man who'd lived the life he'd led. His funeral was small. Samuel and Anne, Margaret leaning on a cane, now her face lined but peaceful. Tom Peterson, who'd survived 5 years in the work camps and 15 years of honest labor. Father O'Brien still making rounds despite his own advanced age. And William, 13 years old, serious-eyed, a Bible in his hands. They buried him in a modest plot in the Boston Cemetery not far from where his father lay. The grave marker was simple. James Sullivan, 1680 to 1745. Husband, father, carpenter, he kept his oath. Samuel had chosen the words carefully. Not loving husband, because that would be a lie. Not pirate, because that was only part of the truth. Just the simple fact that defined James's entire life. He'd sworn an oath over his father's deathbed. He'd broken it and kept it and broken it again. But in the end, in his own broken way, he'd honored it. He'd lived and died trying to be a man of his word, even when his word was impossible to keep. At the graveside, Samuel read from the Bible. Then he pulled out a small brass compass, worn and scratched with initials carved into the case. J.S. This compass belonged to my grandfather, William Sullivan, Samuel said. He gave it to my father when he was 16. My father carried it through every battle, every raid, every dark night of his life. And he gave it to me when I confronted him in that coffee shop. He said it was for finding your way back. He placed the compass on the grave. He found his way back, eventually, not to the life he'd left. That was gone forever. But back to himself, back to the man his father had hoped he'd be. It took him 30 years and cost him everything. But he made it. After the burial, as the small group dispersed, young William approached his father. Grandfather James was a bad man who tried to be good. Samuel considered this. He was a good man who became bad for what he thought were good reasons. And then he spent the rest of his life trying to find his way back to good. It's more complicated than bad or good. Will I be like him? I hope not. I hope you'll be better, smarter. I hope you'll learn from his mistakes instead of repeating them. That's what he would have wanted. But you named me after his father. That must mean something. Samuel knelt down to his son's level. It means that despite everything, despite all the terrible choices he made, James Sullivan tried to honor his father's memory. He failed in almost every way possible. But he tried. And sometimes William trying is enough. Not because it makes the failure acceptable, but because it shows that you still believe in something better than what you've become. I don't understand. You will. When you're older, when you've made your own mistakes and tried to fix them, you'll understand. For now, just know this. Your great-grandfather was a hero. Your grandfather was a criminal. And somehow they were both men of honor. Life is complicated like that. Years later, after Samuel himself had died and William had grown to become a respected shipbuilder, he told his own children the story of James Sullivan. Not the sanitized version, not the romantic pirate tale, but the complicated, messy, painful truth. Your great-great-grandfather, he'd say, taught our family the most important lesson we know, that a man's worth isn't measured in his triumphs or his failures, but in whether he keeps trying to be better than he is. He never stopped trying, even when it cost him everything, even when it would have been easier to give up. Was he a hero, his daughter would ask. No. Was he a villain? No. Then what was he? He was a man, flawed and broken and trying his best with the tools he had. And in the end, that's all any of us are. The question isn't whether we make mistakes. We all do. The question is whether we face them, whether we try to make things right even when right is impossible. Your great-great-grandfather spent his entire life trying to answer that question. And did he find the answer? William would look at the compass that had been passed down through the generations, now sitting on his desk, a family heirloom, and a reminder of the price of honor. I think he found an answer. Maybe not the answer, but his answer. That honor isn't about perfection. It's about direction. It's not about never falling. It's about always getting back up. And it's not about being forgiven by others. It's about making peace with yourself. Is that enough? It has to be. because sometimes it's all we have. And so the story of James Sullivan passed into family legend, not as a cautionary tale or an inspirational story, but as something more complex and true. A reminder that life doesn't offer us clear choices between good and evil, but impossible decisions between different kinds of wrong. And that honor means choosing which wrong you can live with and then living with it day after day, year after year, until the weight becomes bearable. The compass still exists, passed down through 7 generations of Sullivans and Pattersons. It no longer works, the mechanism long since rusted, but the initials remain clear. J.S. James Sullivan, a man who tried to find his way back and in the trying found something else entirely. Not redemption, not forgiveness, not even peace, but something close enough to matter, something close enough to call home.